When Bill Browder's young Russian lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, was beaten to death in a Moscow jail, Browder made it his life's mission to go after his killers and make sure they faced justice. He came up against Vladimir Putin. It is the subject of a compelling book called Freezing Order. Delighted to be joining me live on the line from the UK, I believe, the author of Freezing Over, Bill Browder. Bill, good morning to you.
Good morning to you.
Good to have you with us. For those who don't know this horrifying tale, explain to me a little bit about your what you were doing in Russia and your relationship with Sergei.
So I come from a strange background. My grandfather was the head of the American Communist Party in the 1930s and 1940s. And so in my teenage rebellion, I'm 58, I was born in 1964. In my teenage rebellion, I decided to become a capitalist. And I graduated Stanford Business School the year that the Berlin Wall came down. And I thought if my grandfather was the biggest communist in America and the Berlin Wall has come down, I'm going to try to become the biggest capitalist in Eastern Europe. And so I moved out to Russia. I set up an investment fund called the Hermitage Fund, which I started investing in the stock market, the newly formed stock market in Russia. And for a while, it was going well until I discovered every company that I was investing in were being robbed blind by these people we now know as the oligarchs. I started to scream bloody murder. I started to research how they did the stealing. I started to expose it through the international media. And for a while, it had an interesting and positive effect, just as Putin had come to power because he was fighting with the same guys I was fighting with. They were stealing power from him as they were stealing money from me. But that only lasted a very limited period of time. Putin arrested the richest guy in Russia, a guy named Mikhail Hordakovsky, the owner of an oil company called Yukos, put him on trial, allowed the television cameras to film the richest man in Russia sitting in a cage. All the other oligarchs came to Putin and said, "Hey, Vladimir, what do we have to do so we don't sit in the cage?" And he said 50%. And that was the moment Putin became the richest man in the world. And that was the moment that Putin and my interests diverged very radically. I kept on exposing the oligarchs, but instead of exposing Putin's enemies, I was going after his own personal interests. I was expelled from the country in 2005, declared a threat to national security. My offices were raided in 2007. So they seized all of our documents. And I didn't know what they were up to, but I was pretty scared. And so I hired the smartest lawyer I knew in Russia, who was a young man named Sergei Magnitsky. He was at the time 35 years old. He worked for an American law firm. He researched and investigated and discovered that the reason all of our documents were seized was that a bunch of corrupt officials then used the documents to steal $230 million of taxes that my firm had paid to the Russian government. They stole it, didn't steal it from me. They stole it from the Russian government using a bunch of documents seized from my office. Sergei and I were convinced this must be a rogue operation. Surely Putin wouldn't have authorized it because this was government money being stolen. And so we exposed the crime. We wrote criminal complaints to every law enforcement agency in Russia. Sergei went to the Russian State Investigative Committee, which is their version of the FBI. But instead of investigating the people who stole the money, the people who stole the money arrested him, put him in pretrial detention. They tortured him for 358 days, trying to get him to retract his testimony and sign a false confession to say he stole the money, and he did it on my instruction. Sergei was a man of incredible integrity. He refused. The pressure got worse and worse. They tortured him even more. And on November 16, 2009, Sergei Magnitsky was brutally murdered in Russian police custody at the age of 37.
Bill, when we talk about Putin, it's very easy to go off and demonize Putin for the monster that you're seeing reports he is. And I feel in some ways that we don't spend enough time talking about the decent men and women who stand up to him. And what kind of man, I mean, to sit there and be tortured for over 300 days, he described him as a man of integrity. And I think that's an understatement, because to be in a Russian prison and to be beaten by these goons, it just says something of the character of the man, Bill.
Indeed. I mean, he was the face of what Russia could have been. You know, it's not like Russia is a uniform country with monsters. It's there's a lot of good people there, but they're being the country is occupied by a criminal group. And it's nothing more than a criminal group. The Putin regime is an organized crime group that goes around killing people for money. That's what they do. And in my opinion, the reason why they're killing all these people in Ukraine is because they need a distraction after stealing so much money from their own country, and they need a distraction so the Russian people don't get angry with them, and they're angry at a foreign enemy. Putin is a very, very monstrous character, and I don't think he's demonized enough. And you mentioned, Sergei was this young hero. There are other heroes just like him. There's after Sergei was killed, we then tried to get justice for him, and one of the people who joined me in the fight for justice was a Russian politician named Boris Nemtsov. Boris Nemtsov was an incredible guy who was part of the Yeltsin government. And when Putin came in, he decided to go against Putin, even though that's a very dangerous thing to do. He helped me with my justice campaign, and he was shot dead, 7 bullet holes to the back in front of the Kremlin in February of 2015. I mean, I can go on and on. I have many friends who have been murdered by the Putin regime. This is a very good people, good Russians murdered by bad Russians for trying to make a better country. It
is. I remember John Sweeney, who I interview on a regular basis because he's based in Kyiv at the moment, says that when Boris was killed, he actually cried when he heard that he'd been killed. And Gavin Esler, when I talked about Putin, described Russia as a kleptocracy. They are taking money and on a huge scale from the nation. The saying is always follow the money. So where did this money trail lead you? Was it via Cyprus or other places to accounts in offshore destinations?
So yeah, it did. So when after Sergei was killed, we said, we want to know who got that money, and we want to make sure that money gets taken away from them and they get prosecuted. And so, so this was all, he was killed 13 years ago, more than 13 years ago. And I've been working full time with a team of people funded by me to find where that money went and then to make sure that they're prosecuted. And we found a bunch of money in a lot of different places. And it's interesting. So, first of all, I should say that some of that money ended up in Spain, where you're sitting. And just recently, the Spanish prosecutors seized 75 properties worth about 25 million euros. Some of that money went to Switzerland, and a bunch of money was frozen there. In France, it was frozen. In UK, actually, UK, it wasn't frozen. The UK has been the worst on this whole thing. But I'll tell you what's interesting is that one of the things we discovered in our investigation was that Vladimir Putin got some of the money. And it's not in his own name. When the Panama Papers came out, we discovered that there was this guy. He was a famous cellist from St. Petersburg who was worth $2 billion, according to the Panama Papers. And the question was, why did he get all this money from all oligarchs and state companies and so on? And the answer is that he was Putin's best friend from childhood, the godfather of Putin's daughter, the person who introduced Putin to his first wife. And most importantly, the money wasn't his, that he was a front man for Putin. And when we discovered him, we then started looking through our records and discovered that this guy got some of the money, which meant that Putin got some of the money from the Magnitsky affair. And which explained why Putin has been chasing me around the world with death threats and kidnapping threats and arrest warrants and all sorts of other stuff. In fact, I was even arrested in Madrid back in 2018 when I was going to meet the prosecutor on this money laundering case. The Russians sent out an Interpol warrant for me. And so Putin got some of the money, which is why he hates this whole thing. And then the other thing we discovered from our investigation is that the $230 million crime that we were investigating was just the tip of just this most enormous iceberg. It turns out that there was one bank where it went all the money went through initially in the early stages of the laundering, which was surprisingly a Danish bank called Danske Bank through their Estonian branch. And when we opened this up and we worked with a bunch of Danish journalists in exposing it, the bank was forced to do their own investigation. And when they came back, they said it wasn't $230 million; it was $230 billion that was laundered through their bank. And that was just one bank in one mid-sized Scandinavian country. And I estimate that if you were to lift the hood on Raiffeisen Bank in Vienna and UBS and Credit Suisse in Switzerland and Deutsche Bank in Frankfurt and a few others, you'd probably come close to $1 trillion of illicit funds, of dirty money stolen from Russia, which explains a lot about why Putin is doing this crazy stuff, because there's $1 trillion at stake.
Indeed, you create a diversion, to put it mildly, and get the world to look away. Bill, a lot of people who come out against Putin end up dead. If you look, I mean, you talk about Spain, some oligarchs, it doesn't matter how powerful you are as well. Some oligarchs, of course, died in mysterious circumstances last year. One on Costa Blanca with their whole families, and one in Mallorca, again with his family. Very strange indeed. Does it not worry you, to put it mildly, that you have a powerful man who shows no remorse and will use poison, will use hitmen, will do state-sponsored terrorism to bring down anybody who crosses his path? Surely, as an individual, and you didn't sign up for this. This didn't begin as a moral crusade. You were purely trying to get involved with doing business in the former Soviet Union. Presumably this was the murder of Sergei was a turnaround on how you approached life in general. But to go back to the original point, I mean, are you not worried for your own safety?
Well, as you say, I didn't pick this fight. He picked it. I mean, he murdered Sergei Magnitsky, and Sergei Magnitsky would be alive today if he hadn't been my lawyer, if he hadn't exposed this corruption. And I owe it to Sergei not to be afraid. If Sergei wasn't afraid, he wasn't ready to sell me out in prison when they were torturing him. I owe it to him not to give up and not to be scared and to hold these people to account. And yeah, it's scary, it's dangerous, it's awful. They've done a lot of terrible things and they're constantly after me and trying to get me arrested, sent back to Russia, and kidnapped, and all sorts of other nasty stuff. So far I've survived. But I'm not going to back down. And, everybody has their own way of dealing with these things, but the way I deal with it is not to go to ground, not to withdraw my allegations. It's to make the allegations even stronger and go public. You come on your show, talk about it everywhere, anywhere. And I'm going to continue to do that.
You mentioned that you were served by Interpol in Madrid. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Just to talk me through what goes through your mind then, if you know that you are on Putin's hit list, as it were, figuratively, I was going to say figuratively, but absolutely. What goes through your mind when somebody says, Hank, you're detained somewhere at an airport, at a port, walking down the street?
Well, in this particular case, I had flown into Madrid to meet with the chief anti-corruption prosecutor of Spain, a guy named Jose Grinda, because we had found dirty money from the Magnitsky case in Spain, and he invited me to give a sworn statement so that they could open the case. So I show up in Madrid. I'm staying at the Grand Hotel Ingles in a very nice hotel, and they give me a beautiful upgrade to suite, and I'm really enjoying it the night before. And then I wake up the next day. I open the door, and there's the manager of the hotel about to knock with two police officers. And he says, show them your ID. I give them my passport. They say, you're under arrest. What for? Interpol Russia. At this point, I was able to pack my bags. And while I was packing them, I tweeted out, being arrested right now on a Russian warrant. And then I get into the back of the police car. And I'm thinking to myself, wait a second, maybe these guys aren't real cops. I mean, how hard is it for guys to get some uniforms, maybe steal a police car, misrepresent themselves to the hotel? I thought, well, maybe and then when you're in the back of the police car, you can't open the windows, or unlock the door. You're stuck. And I thought to myself, oh man, God, this could be a really bad situation. I could be, they could drive out to an airstrip, and the next thing I know, I'm waking up in Moscow. And so then it got even worse. They stopped at some nondescript building, and I said, "What are we here for?" And they said, "Medical exam." And I thought, "Oh my God, medical exam? What nonsense is that? I'm not doing any medical exam. I don't want anyone injecting me with something." And turned out that, and so I stood my ground, no medical exam. And when they finally took me to the police station, I was actually relieved that I was just being arrested and not illegally kidnapped and sent to Russia. And it was only because I tweeted it out that so many people started then calling the Spanish Interior Ministry and Interpol and Lyon that it turned into a big political hot potato, and they dropped it. But it's pretty scary stuff. Definitely.
When you talk with financial institutions who handle this money, or people who sell real estate or luxury cars or whatever it is, does it make you mad? Does the apathy, like, oh well, we're just handling the money, or it's got to come from somewhere? Do you think that people turn a blind eye to where this money comes from, and who's buying this stuff, and who's sending these transfers of millions of dollars? Does that not drive you absolutely apoplectic when you think of what happened?
Yeah, it does. And it did, it does, and it will. But the one thing that these people, such a cynical bunch, and it's not even a blind eye would suggest they're not even aware of it. These people are aware of it, and they're still doing it. But what's very satisfying is watching all these people squirming as they're getting caught up in sanctions and having, permanent life problems of their own now because they got involved with these, murders. And by the way, it's worse. It's actually worse in my mind for a Westerner to knowingly get involved with this than even the Russians who did it. The Putin guys, they're all monsters, but they were sort of born monsters. They were like in the jungle. They were like, they were beaten when they were like, 2 months old. And that's just how the fully warped people. But the guys in the West, they all had gentle upbringings and went to the same schools and, worshipped in the same churches and, are at the same school gates picking up their kids. And they know what they're doing. They didn't have the hardships to become monsters. They're like knowingly becoming monsters. That's actually worse in my mind.
Mm. And Putin's shown himself able to lash out. I mean, it's interesting the amount of false information that gets spread, the undue influence, the electioneering, the referendum tapering. It all sort of links back, doesn't it, to the former Soviet Union?
Yeah, it was very inexpensive for Putin. These guys really took advantage of all of our open system, with Facebook and Twitter and freedom of speech, and they hire a bunch of people to lawyers to sue anyone who says anything bad about them, and it's very we were totally weak. It was very inexpensive. Hardly any money was spent for them to tip the scales for Donald Trump back in 2016, tip the scales on Brexit, tip all sorts of scales. They love doing that stuff. Easy to do, and our open system allows them to do it.
It is a David v. Goliath, though, isn't it? I mean, people say, "Oh, well, you can't do anything about it." The broad sweeping canvas, which is completely misinformation. Oh, well, the Russians have always been like this, and as you said, there are good people. Sergei was a good person, and people tend to take a blind eye and say, "Well, you can't do anything about that. It's always been like that." And before it's just a new coat, but it's always the Soviet Union or the Russian Empire, etc.
Well, I mean, that's how people viewed my campaign to get justice. And we ended up getting laws passed in 35 countries called the Magnitsky Act, named after my lawyer who was murdered, Sergei Magnitsky, which freezes assets and bans the visas of these people. And for guys who value money more than human life, having their assets frozen is pretty horrifying. They really, really don't like it. But I was sort of an individual David versus the Goliath. But now what we're seeing is the Ukrainians are Davids versus Goliath, and they're holding up they're fighting like hell and giving Putin a very black eye. And so everybody wants to overstate how powerful Putin is. They're all scared of him. They all think his military was number 2. They all think he's somehow invincible, and he's not. He's really not. And 90% of his power comes from us just assuming that he has that power.
And I suppose the thing is, because again, people assume, oh well, he's the ex-head of KGB. He is invincible. But once that deck of cards starts quivering, once that deck of cards starts falling, then you may see this crumble very, very quickly indeed, especially if the money dries out.
Absolutely. And that's the point of sanctions. And we just have to stand firm. He's really suffering right now. He's truly suffering. I've been over the weekend, I was reading reports about, the sale of oil and gas, which it took them 50 years to build up Europe as a big reliable customer, and they just ruined it in like whatever 50 weeks, and it's not going to be good for Putin. The sanctions, the oil, the whole thing is going to come undone very quickly. And having said that, we've seen a lot of countries, with bad dictators last a very long time, even with terrible economies. Look at Zimbabwe. Look at North Korea. Iran. These are countries that are not thriving economically, but somehow they have these dictators that just hang on like cockroaches.
Freezing order follows on from your previous book, Red Notice. What are you hoping that people? If you wrote this as a thriller in terms of a piece of fiction, people go, "Oh yeah, that's that." You've certainly got incredible powers of imagination, but this is real life. And so, what do you hope that people are gonna take from freezing order?
Well, I think it's pretty obvious when you read it. First of all, it's not a political science book. It's a thriller, but it's a real life thriller, and everybody reads it. Can't put it down. But what I want people to take away from it, which is the easy thing and the obvious thing to take away, is that Russia's not a country; it's a criminal organization. And when you come to that conclusion, then it's easy to understand what needs to be done, which is, you can't negotiate with criminals, you can't placate criminals, you can't compromise with criminals. You have to destroy the criminals, and that's the only solution with the Putin regime, is that they need to be completely isolated and destroyed. And it's easy to see that when you read my book and you understand what I've been through, because my story is really a microcosm of what's going on broadly in Russia.
The book is called Freezing Order. It's by Bill Browder, who we're speaking to today. Bill, if people want to follow you on the social medias or the websites, can they find you online?
Yeah, I've got a big following and a big Twitter presence at Bill Browder, BILLBROWDER.
The book is called Freezing Order. It's by Bill Browder. And Bill, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.